Bonjour, messieurs, dames, bonjour. Je suis donc...
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Raphael Legendre. I'm a chief editor at the newspaper L'Opinion. I'm very happy to be here with you today. And we will be discussing the main global risk this morning. And with the next roundtable, we will be focusing more specifically on geopolitical risks in a world that is increasingly fragmented. And I know that this is a major issue for you as professionals of marine global trade, wars, crises, tensions on trade routes, and some points that cannot be avoided. And this, of course, has an impact on the operations of traffic, of trade, and we face currently insecurity, saturation, etc. So there are many disruptions in marine global trade. And in order to have a clear vision of these risks, I'm going now to call our panelists on the stage. First of all, Admiral Bernard ROGEL. Admiral ROGEL, former French Navy Chief of Staff and former personal French President Chief of Staff from the French Navy. Your latest book is entitled Memoirs of a Seaman at with the French President. Maxence, BRISCHOUX Research Fellow, Centre THUCYDIDE Paris 2, PANTHEON ASSAS, and Editorial Board Member of the COMMENTAIRE journal. His latest book is Geopolitics at Sea. And now I would like to call on stage Anne-Sophie ALSIF. A big round of applause. Chief Economist at BDO and specialized in European and competitiveness questions, also for focusing more specifically on business. And Anne-Sophie just published a book on protectionism. And I would like to call on stage Mathieu DAUBIN from AXA APAC, head of underwriting services and member of GAREX. So, to get things started, I'm going to give you the floor, Admiral Bernard ROGEL. Could you maybe tell us about the state of the world today? What are the main forces of change that are currently impacting marine global trade routes? And from a more practical point of view, have we forgotten about a happy globalization as we had hoped at the beginning of the century? Not quite. But we need to understand that the strategic paradigm that had determined international relations at the end of Cold War is over. We are in a changing world. And since the world is changing, we need to completely review, overhaul our paradigms. And this is the main difficulty faced by Western countries. We need to realize that our world is undergoing major disruptions. So there's no reason to be scared, but we need to adapt to this new world. The former world that you just described as a happy, globalized world. So this was a world that had been organized to absorb the trade of data and goods in the exo-atmospheric space, in the cyberspace, as well as by sea. And in this world, Western states had a monopoly on pretty much everything. The economy, strategic, military, strategic. And this world, in a way, was quite comfortable to us. So I would say that it's less comfortable to Western states now. And I think that it's going to be more unstable and more complex to define. And maybe slightly more dangerous as well. So the question that you are asking me today, well, I spent 8 hours explaining it to my students in Brest. So I'm going to try and summarize it for you today. There are 3 main disruptions currently that started emerging 10 years ago, and these are the major trends today. The first trend is the coming back of power strategies. And this is done living on the side some more diplomatic routes. In the past, the UN played a major role in the resolution of crisis, but now the situation is different. This leads to interstate tensions or conflicts. This is what we saw in Ukraine, for instance. But we should not focus too much on Ukraine either. This is a major event. It is the war that is closest to us. But there are other interstate tensions elsewhere in the world. For instance, in the east of the Mediterranean, in China as well. So these interstate tensions are developing. And there's also a comeback of nuclear power in our strategic rationale. This is something that had been left on the side at the end of the Cold War. And we can see that President Putin is now using that kind of language very dangerously. And there are also tensions that are growing everywhere. So in the previous roundtables, you talked about high-intensity war. So we can definitely see a comeback of that. And at the height of the Cold War, we had $1,500 billion that were spent on the military. And today we're talking about $2,400 billion. So are you saying that the level of investment in the military on a like-for-like basis with inflation, which is at a similar level? No, it's actually higher because it's 1,500 against 2,400 today. And this is something that we see everywhere. For instance, the Chinese Navy is building the equivalent of the French Navy capabilities every 3 years. And they are investing at the same level as the US Navy. So as we say at War School, it's about power-based strategy. So there's the end of the Western monopoly in terms of military power. And this is a very important thing to keep in mind. The second consequence, the second finding, is that since this is happening also in the Indo-Pacific space, the US are turning to this space. So these are 2 trends that are going to have a big impact on global strategies. And the second main disruptions is the conflictualization of common spaces. So common spaces that were routes for our spaces, so the sea, exo-atmospheric space, and cyberspace. And this is what enabled us to develop the movement of goods and data. And this is becoming more militarized. And this is what we can see in the sea. We can see that there are growing tensions. And as you might know, 90% of global trade is done through shipping. So 90% of what we consume every day comes from the sea. And 99% of digital intercontinental exchanges as well. So these spaces that were demilitarized in that era of happy globalization are now becoming increasingly militarized. This is what we see in the Indian Ocean, in China Sea. We see that around gas fields as well. So we see that there is a territorialization of the sea. The sea used to be a space for flows, for exchanges, and we can see new borders emerging. And the third trend is the coming of age of hybrid strategies. So we were used to high-intensity conflicts, but we also have everything that happens below that threshold of conflicts. So we can think of manipulation of information and the interference with democratic processes. But this can also relate to unclaimed attacks on oil tankers in Hormuz in 2019 that led to the launch of Agena operation. This can also relate to cyber warfare and attack on subsea facilities, including subsea cables. And we also we also faced it with the mysterious explosions on the Nord Stream gas pipelines. So this can be an impact, for instance, on some marine routes, on attacks in the Persian Gulf. So we can see that we have some underlying tensions, underlying attacks that are unclaimed, but that add up to the risks, and that are risks that are as significant as other more blatant conflicts. So in a nutshell, these are the three main disruptions, but we can also talk about technological disruption with AI. This is something that will require some adaptation from us. Climate change as well, which will have an impact and which will lay the ground for future crises with extreme climate events. And one last challenge, the era of impatience, as I call it, meaning that in our current society, we need to have short-term results, which goes against the long-term strategies that we need in the field of defense. So we'll come back to that later in our roundtable. Thank you very much, Admiral ROGEL. That was very clear. So we heard that wars are changing, strategies are changing and becoming hybrid, and players in these geopolitical tensions are also changing. So Geopolitics at Sea is the title of your latest book. Well, this book is selling well thanks to the current news, so you can also contribute to this revenue, to the sales. Well, it's true that things are changing, but the future might look like our past, because what is coming back is actually very ancient wars and conflicts. We can think of pirates, for instance. And as we said, we depend a lot on the sea for transport, for digital communication. So if you attack trade, if you attack marine routes, you can really weaken your opponent. And this is what Russia did with Ukraine to block the Ukrainian exports, getting a strategic advantage from this. And this went back to a normal state gradually. But in any case, that kind of commercial war and that kind of war at sea is changing significantly. And as Admiral ROGEL just explained, it is becoming easier and easier to act on the sea from the land. And this is actually quite an old strategy as well, as we saw in Istanbul with the Turkish Straits. And we saw that Ukraine managed to win down the Russian Navy from the ground with missiles. And in the Red Sea, the main player is a non-state player that is not recognized by Yemen, fighting against Saudi Arabia and UAE. And they have managed to reduce by half traffic through that strait. So with the use of missiles and with the availability of missiles, many groups can now have an impact on the sea. It's a locust war. Yes, absolutely. It's a form of locust war that is changing fundamentally the operational and military balance. And this increases risks. It's important to note that it's a transition. Not everything is changing overnight. And this transition from the sea to the land is happening mainly on strategic straits, because for practical reasons, these straits are quite narrow, and ships have to go through what we call these chop points. And what's interesting in what's happening in the Red Sea, and Anne-Sophie can also talk about it later, we were wondering if this would have a macroeconomic impact on prices. Well, what we've noticed so far is that there's a real capacity of adaptation and flexibility in marine freight. So you can go through Bab el-Mandeb, even if it costs more to go around Africa in terms of ship maintenance and energy costs. But we have a greater offer in terms of marine routes now, so we can change routes to adapt to this new context. And what's happening in the Red Sea says nothing about what will happen tomorrow. We could imagine other issues even more intense in Hormuz or in other straits that are even more critical than Bab el-Mandeb. So, in any case, as you know very well, the flexibility of marine transport is really appreciated. Even if there have been some blockades of goods or oil deliveries, but this could have been a lot more severe. In France, we tend to talk about the comeback of global powers, of new strategies, but we have now entered a new bloc-based paradigm. We have various blocks that are facing one another with major powers in each one of them. So Jean-Yves Le Drian, a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, during the naval conference in Paris organized in January, he explained that we have a bloc with Iran, China and Russia. And this bloc is acting in the conflict in Ukraine to impose some very aggressive strategies. And what's interesting here for us in terms of marine geopolitics is that this is a continental bloc with forces that are traditionally land forces and that are pushing on Taiwan, on Ukraine, on the whole area in the Middle East. And in a way, this bloc, as continental powers, with some continental solidarity, this bloc is also trying to control the sea, because they're trying to have some control over these landlocked seas, including the Red Sea and the Black Sea. And the main features of these seas is that everything needs to go through it at some point for deliveries of goods or commodities. And for geographical reasons, it's easy to lock these seas because they are landlocked. And so this is where some major military decisions could be taken. Because as I explained, it's very easy to have a strong impact on these areas with aviation, missiles, drone. And so you can have a very big impact without having a very big fleet. And in the Asian Pacific area, we can see that tensions are rising. We can see that there's a build-up of arsenals as well, and with a very strong economic impact.
Moving on to the economic impact of these rising geopolitical tensions, as the Admiral said, every 3 years, China builds the equivalent of our French National Navy. This is quite impressive. All this geopolitical pressure, of course, has some economic pressures and consequences. You said something about the price of insurance, which was more expensive. Yes, there's inflation on insurance. That's a different. I was in a different but similar debate 2 weeks ago, and so the question is that if Western navies are deployed in the Red Sea to try and block Houthi shootings to guarantee the freedom of the sea, how can we make sure that we can re-establish traffic? And so it appeared during the discussion that the price of insurance, the price of oil as well, and rates are still adjusted by the Egyptians to cross the Suez Canal. So this is the main driver in a decision to use that route. And so I understand that insurers and brokers estimate war risk and damage risk, and that's going to be a major factor in the return to normal. So there are Houthi actions that add to the geopolitical context. They can block trade. There are two Western actions, one by the EU, one by the US, that can intercept the main strikes, but they can't build enough confidence to restore traffic. So insurers are a major player in seeing how far this situation is normalized and secure enough to go back to normal. Mathieu will talk about that later, but I wanted to give the floor to Anne-Sophie ALSIF, Chief Economist of the BDO firm. We've established the big picture in terms of geopolitics and rising tension. Of course, all that has major consequences on the economy. Where are we now? It's true that what's quite interesting is the rise of geopolitical shocks, and protectionism is something fairly old. Now we've got more visible shocks because we are impacted on a daily basis on transit times, and if you watch the media, the news, you can see that it's going to take longer. There's more visible risk. But this protectionism system started over 15 years ago, and not in the countries that we mentioned, the most well-known, especially in Latin American countries that started getting very protectionistic, with access to the country that would be less and less easy, and also, as we said, in Algeria, North Africa, Russia, China. So we can see that this is something really old, and not just for some emerging countries or Western countries, but really all countries, especially developing countries. Another thing that we're seeing in the book, that's what we try to determine, this protectionism and this economic vulnerability to geopolitical risk at sea, how is that translated into concrete terms? Well, the strategies differ depending on the sectors. What we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years, if you look at sectoral specialization by bloc, we discussed it, US, China, or EU. Europe, that's been traditionally specialized in more traditional industries like metallurgy or pharmaceuticals. These are sectors that were the most fragmented in terms of value And so there are more foreign steps abroad before going to the end consumer. Metallurgy or pharmaceuticals, you can have 30 or 40 production steps abroad using world trade before going back to the European territories and coming back to the territory. But in China and the US, with more recent specialization, the strategy of these two blocks is to still have major production steps, but are more localized in terms of regions. If you look at the industrial situation in Europe as opposed to China or the US, you can see that in the other two blocks, there are fewer production steps abroad before reaching the final consumer. So if you have a major political risk in the world, China and the US have better control over their value chain than we. And with all the conflicts that we've talked about, we used to think, well, yes, that's true, but we still have competitive markets and especially attractive prices, because price, especially when it comes to transport, was always an essential determinant, at least in Europe. Now we can see that the two blocks have very different strategies. In China, it's about having trade agreements that are always more important, to have fewer and fewer barriers, to also get access to the sea. So there's the RCIP signed with all Pacific states, the biggest trade agreement with South Korea, Japan, and less developed countries, and there are almost no trade tariffs with China that can export its goods. And after the Russian crisis, the Chinese foothold in Africa is very big and very diversified. China's goal was to go to Africa and capture positions in terms of land and energy, but not in just two countries, as was the case in former powers. They are really diversified in as many countries as possible to have strategic interests and strong positions. With that, with these strategic interests in Africa, they also get access to the sea. So value chains are better and better controlled. We hear a lot about EVs because in Europe it's a real issue, but what is China's strength in this area? They have control of the whole value chain from design to manufacturing to transport over the last 20 years. They have a real strategy. They're an industrial leader there, not just in R&D. This is the discussion that we often have in Europe, but if they want to be the leader of this or that sector, how can they lock down everything? So that's maritime transport and access to trade, but also everything that is strategic and geopolitical, not just economic matters, as was previously the case in international trade. For the US, it's more recent, and that was in response to China's strategy. It's a very much deindustrialized country that wanted to reindustrialize, and they did that with programs to attract firm investments, to relocate manufacturing, but the IRA is also to have manufacturing on American soil. And if you control production, you are less dependent on sea or air routes. You can have direct access to your production. So this is the very big economic change lately. There used to be just one factor in the factors of production that you try to optimize with labor. Now it's a strategic aspect that's internalized in the bloc's reindustrialization strategies, and those that are really in the lead now there are China and the US ahead of Europe, because since Europe is specialized in more traditional sectors, the value chain are much more scattered and much less controlled, with a lot of fragmentation in value chains. What you're saying is that in spite of reindustrialization that we've been hearing a lot in the last few years, in spite of real changes in the approach to the European industrial policy, it used to be a bad word in Germany 10 years ago only. Now we're getting there, and we're putting protections in place at the borders of Europe, such as the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Europe is still lagging behind China and the US. As you said very well, there have been major advances and realization as well. In these conflicts, it's not us versus the other Europeans. In the European European election, we were so much centered on France, but we're not an island. It's so very good to focus on that, to take all these elements into account when you want to reindustrialize, but we can see that there's no European industrial policy. Countries are very fragmented. €1 spent in France needs to have return in France, ditto in Germany. That's what Airbus is doing. But the US is spending billions in innovation, as is China. It's not because this is pure benevolence. They want to create more wealth before you can redistribute. That's the basic. And once you've created wealth, then you need to invest in strategic sectors. So the other two blocks, be it electric cars or space or any number of sectors like defense, they have this vision. Whereas we are more defensive. We want to respond to what other blocks are doing to try and protect our industry. That's all well and good, but in other sectors like healthcare, we have major competitive edges, so we could develop new technologies with this strategic vision, not just to see what innovation we can have in Europe, but we should have a comprehensive value chain vision so that we are independent in case of conflict. Thank you, Anne-Sophie. ALSIF, I'm turning to you, Mathieu DAUBIN. You're the head of marine underwriting for AXA XL and the chairman of COMAT and GAREX. From your vantage points, what are concretely the risks and changes that were highlighted in geopolitical and economic terms for the economic agents that we've got in the room? Well, thank you, Maxence. Thank you, Admiral, for illustrating all the conflicts that there are in the Red Sea, in the Black Sea, the Hormuz Straits. Of course, there are repercussions on maritime traffic. That highlights the weight and challenge of war risk insurance, which traditionally was subscribed by marine insurance. I noted that there were 270 incidents in the Red Sea. This has been the case since the conflict started in October. Out of 270 incidents, there were 4 major ones: the REVUE Bima that we all remember, the Galaxy, True Confidence, and Tutor last week. This is material damage, but unfortunately also human casualties. That's the risk that we're mostly talking about: damage, delays, consequences on supply chains, and also port congestion. This is something that's very concrete that will ensure or not. But these various conflicts reminded us of the vital role of marine insurance in supporting global trade. People tended to forget it, but thank you, Louis and Cécile, for reminding us of that earlier. Us marine insurers, we deemed that we've got a role to play to guarantee and ensure free traffic at sea with the help of national navies, and insurance is also playing a role. Let me remind you that the first types of insurance were marine insurance in Babylon, Genoa, the Colbert order that was then copied by Lloyd's in London. So this is where we are, and we're still doing it because there are still 20 or 30 ships going through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait every day, and these are generally ships that are insured. But if you look at insurance and war risk, we think that these are two notions that cannot necessarily be reconciled. Is there really a hazard associated to war risk? Well, yes, there is a hazard, and insurers have been playing this role as experts in terms of assessment in the grading of that risk. Based on that grading, although it's a very competitive market, we set a rate, a premium. Now, that's still peanuts in terms of cost. I know that very often in newspapers you read that the price of insurance, the price of freight, that has a lot of consequences. But if you look at the total price for a loader, for a consumer, that's really peanuts, although it seems very high at times, but it's peanuts. So this assessment work is carried out by insurance operators in France. It's done with help from Sesam. with also partners that help us set an assessment based on risks. With that, you can highlight, I mean, of course, we are all convinced of that in this audience, but we in France have a leading role in terms of war risk, either through economic interest groupings via GAREX or private underwriting agencies or insurance companies and also all brokers. On the French market, we consider that we have a lot of expertise in that. We are experts in that. Although some have forgotten this risk, it's important to strike a balance again. It's not compulsory insurance, it's optional. You may subscribe it or not, but if you subscribe it, you need to do it well. You need to assess it, set a rate, use information, usually coming from geopolitical analysts and even analysts from the French Navy. And with that, we're able to ensure and ensure freedom of navigation and make sure that cargo reaches the ports that it's supposed to go to. That's the role I wanted to remind you of for insurers. Now let's talk about inflationary effects that we all remember in the room. We hear a lot of things. Inflation may not be so high as all that. You've got 40 footers that went from 3,000 to 6,000 euros. What should we expect in the short and mid-term? Maxence, would you like to answer, or maybe Anne-Sophie later? Well, inflation is one thing, but the disorganization of maritime transport is another. So one stems from the other. Maybe this international disorganization and rising tensions maybe lead to inflation. Well, we've seen an increase in prices, harbor congestion, and also some anticipation and expectations by all the business operators, but maybe the end user does not realize all that. They're also citizens, and so when they vote, do they realize how difficult it is with the life of sailors at stake and constant tensions and congestion? So consumers have not been impacted enough, maybe. This is something we could talk about, but beyond the ability that private agents have to adapt, well, then we use resources like the French Navy and European coalitions to restore traffic. But one of the consequences of how dangerous the marine world is, and also if you look at the trends mentioned by Admiral ROGEL, well, we need military means to guarantee security of supply. That's essential. So inevitably, are we moving to an inflationary world that will be more expensive with rising costs and longer routes, higher premiums that will have to be passed on at some point on final goods? That's rather the trend that we've been identifying. If you take the Ukrainian crisis, if you look at that through the sectoral lens, there were differences based on sectors and strategy. Coming back to my indicator, the number of foreign steps of production before you reach the final user, of course, there's going to be an increase in prices, but what's more complicated is that there will be inequalities between producers based on who controls their value chain and who doesn't. That's what we were saying about the reindustrialization strategies. What we've been seeing since the Ukraine crisis and energy shocks, textile was very impacted by inflation that resulted into relocation. Some brands produced in China or Europe, well, they relocated to Turkey, closer to the consumer because risks were too high and margins were slim on these types of products. And so margin rates will vary depending on the impact. Since in Europe we're rather specialized on traditional industry, heavy industry, we've talked about pharmaceuticals, metallurgy with a lot of production steps, the risk is that maybe we could be further impacted than other countries like the US with inexpensive energy, so they've been relocating their industry very heavily, and China, with trade agreements, has access to high growth areas and a lot of consumers. That's not to mean that they're not interested in Europe anymore, because there are a lot of goods to be taken there. But in the midterm, that might be a possibility. And the risk is that we, with our industry, we might be left out in the cold. And so we would bear the brunt of that increase, of that inflation, and we wouldn't be able, in terms of margins, to limit the impact on prices, on consumer prices, whereas the US or Chinese products wouldn't be facing this issue, and they would have much cheaper products. So in a way, it's rather an issue of fragmentation. Well, consumers think, well, yes, it's European, so maybe there's a bit more in it, so I'll agree to pay a bit more to get that product. Or am I going to buy Chinese products more with a big price impact? In general, it's an easy choice. Well, we saw that during COVID. We didn't change things at all. After COVID, we went back to our old ways. There was no behavior change at all. And now even Chinese products are going up market. So they're also competitive on quality. Sometimes they're much better for cars, solar panels, semiconductors. So the risk for European consumers would be to choose these products at attractive prices with even better quality, whereas more European products would be less competitive. Maybe there will be more protectionistic barriers around Europe. That's always the dilemma. But if European states consider that they don't have the same interest and don't agree in putting these strategies in place, that's not going to be all-out protectionism, but in some sectors will have competitive edges with these new political players will need to intervene. Well, people tend to smile. They say that we can't be protectionistic because China will get cross and there will be retaliation. What's surprising is that China is massively subsidizing its economy and industry, and they're not playing by the rules, and we're one of its main competitors, and not afraid of our own retaliatory measures at all. Mathieu DAUBIN, structurally, is insurance going to be more expensive because the world is more and more risky? Or is there going to be more granularity in terms of services so that you can limit that price increase? Well, eventually, insurers are there and they pay for losses. Our role is to pool risks, and so yes, premiums are going to go up because there's more risk. At AXA XL, we reckon that the future, well, it's not a risk, but for each new risk, we've got a solution. But for each solution, there are insurance terms and conditions, there are premiums, sometimes public-private partnerships for climate risks. But yes, I think that with the various risks that were described earlier, geopolitical, cyber, and climate, we can imagine that premiums are going to go up. But that's only a fair distribution and fair pooling between all risk operators. That's our role. We saw that industrially Europe was lagging behind China and the US that invested massively, especially with the IRA. In marine terms, industrial and commercial fleets in France, where are they? Where do they stand? Admiral, would you like to answer? Europe is the biggest ship owner in the world, if you believe the interpretation that I have. I wanted to bring an optimistic note. That seems to be lacking. It's weird that it's the former military man bringing some optimism, but I don't believe. Well, I have difficulties with the notion of global south and blocks. I think that now the world is being reorganized around continent states. There's one country we haven't mentioned yet since the beginning of this discussion, India. Yes, maybe a rapprochement with the US and the Western Bloc. Yes, although it's an alliance of opportunity between China and Russia, I'm not seeing that as a bloc. It's rather an opportunistic alliance, trying to explain to the West that we've lost our monopoly on technological and military and diplomatic power, even economic power. That's what I was saying earlier. My optimistic note is that right now there aren't too many countries that have an interest in maritime trade being stopped, although it's likely that for some sectors it's going to become more regional. That might be true for container carriers, we'll see, for the reasons mentioned by Madam. For bulk carriers and oil carriers, we're not going to grow wheat in the Sahara, and we won't find oil in off the shores of France. So that's going to be global for the next few years. The only disruptive force might be Russia, that's less dependent on maritime flows. There's a closed sea that we haven't talked at all about, is the Baltic. The Baltic Sea will become a major challenge, if only because the neutral countries that were there have joined NATO, so that will increase tensions. There will be rising tensions, but I don't think that the marine sector is so threatened that everything would grind to a halt. There will be local tensions. There will be some rerouting, as the case in Hormuz. There will be hybrid strategies that could go as far as mining near our shores, using sea mines. But I don't think that marine traffic will stop. It will be fragmented. But for Europe, the real question is whether we're able to get ready in marching order in Europe. That's the question we would ask European powers, but we haven't found the solution. Well, being in a marching order would be to be competitors to the US, China, or Russia. If we can't really get in marching order, we would be a small nation compared to these big blocs. That doesn't mean that we would be bad. That simply means that we'll have a critical mass issue. Our country at the global scale, when faced with these huge competitors that are emerging, would we lose? Well, that's the real issue for Europe. Our future is at stake. A simple question. Maritime traffic is rising structurally despite these tensions? Or since COVID, has it stayed flat or going down? No, there's been a rebound after COVID, as I was saying. All attempts at degrowth, to have more local consumption at the global scale, that hasn't worked out at all. And if you look at forecasts, especially because of population growth, until we reach a peak, there will be an increase in trade because some countries are developing more and more. That's fairly positive. You could have a positive note to wrap up. Trade is related to economic development and poverty reduction, so it's rather positive. In my view, the big issue is that of price because of geopolitical risk and the environmental transition. So yes, there will still be trade. It will still be major, but at what cost and what consequences for the consumer? That's the question for me. And if you'll allow me to add to what was said by Maxence earlier, we need to be aware that this international situation is, how to put it, the power struggle between the Westerners and the parts of the world are changing, especially in naval terms. When you look at the size of our navies, the French Navy is a great navy. It's amongst the most operational in the world, with vessels navigating and crews that are proud of being seamen. But there's a question about the format that will always be asked. But it's been forever, ever since we've had navies. Will our navy be strong enough to face that boom in military navies in the world? With some characteristics, such as submarines. Now there's a proliferation of submarines that is big, with nearly 500 modern submarines in 20 countries, something that was unheard of a while ago. Now, will we be able to get ready, all our ducks lined in a row in Europe? Well, I'm still optimistic. look at how we faced piracy in the Indian Ocean. We set up the Operation Atalanta by the EU. And also in 2019, there were unclaimed attacks on oil tankers in the Straits of Hormuz, which is a highly sensitive straits. We were able to set up Operation Agenor. Aspides, also a European protection in the Red Sea, proves that we're able to come together, to band together as soon as we share strategic interests, and it's very often the case at sea. So it's in nobody's interest to see global trade weaken. So we can really get our ducks lined in a row. Now we'll need really to face the increase in military navies across the board, so you can derive your own conclusions about our French Navy. Well, I'm delighted that we're ending on an optimistic note. You can give them some applause. Thank you so much, everybody. Amiral, ROGEL, Mathieu BRISCHOUX, Maxence BRISCHOUX, Mathieu DAUBIN, Anne-Sophie ALSIF.